Good target selection in the last spell can be the difference between S ranking a knight and D ranking that very same knight. The reality of the game is that there will always be more baddies to slaughter than your heroes have action points to slaughter them with. So to that end, in this, the 6th video in my absolute beginner's guide to the last spell, we're going to be covering each and every enemy in the last spell so they never get the jump on you ever again. So after the last video, I gave it some thought and I realized that it didn't make any sense to do the combat guide before we did the enemies guide. So in this video, we're going to cover each and every enemy in the last spell. What we're going to talk about is the nature of those enemies, what their moveset and abilities look like, the stats that particular enemy has, what's their durability, do they have any strengths or weaknesses, what's good for killing them, not. And then I collected a bunch of specific numbers around the nature of enemies, how much hit points they have and things like that, but we're not going to talk specifically about that. Instead, we're going to give you a broad strokes view of what each of the enemies is kind of like. Do they have high hit points or low hit points, above average damage or below average damage? The reason is that in the last spell, everything scales. If you run into a crawler on the first night of a particular campaign or on the 10th night, they are going to have different attributes because the game scales with you. Also, which map you choose or what apocalypse difficulty you choose is going to change those stats as well. So it's not useful to talk about specific stats. It's much more useful to talk about generalizations regarding the nature of enemies. This enemy has a lot of armor. This armor has very low health. And then last but not least, we're going to talk about an analysis of them. What approaches are good for dealing with them? Why are they a threat? What makes them a threat? Things we won't be talking about in this video is I won't be spoiling any of the bosses or what any of the elite enemies look like. I think those are both fun surprises and you should play through the last spell yourself in order to run into those and get those surprises. That being said, we will talk about elite modifiers at the end of this video. I'll discuss kind of how to think about and how to deal with specific elite modifiers. So one of the primary concepts that's going to be kind of the underpinning of this video is what I refer to as classes of enemies. When I think about the enemies in the last spell, there's kind of 3 tiers of enemies. The lowest tier, the tier 1 enemies, are your meat and potato cannon fodder. They're the enemies that you primarily run into in Gildenberg and early Lakeburg, and they are generally designed to tutorialize a mechanic. And we'll talk about this in more detail when we get into it. But as an example, the armored enemy is there to tutorialize how armor works, for lack of a better description. So those enemies are really your introductory enemies. Then your tier 2 enemies are often most easily thought of as like evolutions of those base level tier 1 enemies. And they usually add in some special attributes or some uniqueness or characteristics that make them additionally challenging. And then your tier 3 enemies are where the real big bad guys live, the ones that really ruin your day and end your runs. But the thing that is important to consider with each of these classes is that I am going to be using relative descriptors to describe a particular enemy's hit points or how much armor they have, and that will always be within the context of a particular class. And the reason is that if I didn't do that, tier 1, everything would be low armor, low HP, etc., and everything in tier 3 would be high HP, high armor, so on. So it's much more useful to compare and contrast enemies within a particular class. So that's the plan. Now, talking about the specifics, I'm going to flash up a template here that is the template that I'm going to use to talk about each monster. And basically what we're going to cover is the flavor of the monster, because I think that's just fun, then the stats in that relative framework that I was describing before, then the abilities of that particular enemy, what skills do they have to choose from, and then last, my analysis and reasoning for the way I approach them, how much of a threat I think they are, and how I dispatch with them. So, without further ado, it's time to talk about Tier 1 mobs. And Tier 1 mobs, as I mentioned before, are those baseline mobs that are largely teaching you something about the game. One of the things that they teach you is that using the right things to kill the right enemies is particularly important. So, to go through this really quickly, the first is the Claw. And the Claw, named after the incessant screeching of their claws against stone and metal, they are attracted to any source of magic like flies to corpses. The magic circle shines like a beacon to them. Luckily, they are quite stupid. So the Claw is your absolute baseline enemy. And unlike most of the enemies, there are a whole variety of different variations of the Claw. So I'm going to flash that up somewhere on the screen here so that you can see them. But it's important to note that Claws come in many forms, but they are all very much the most basic and baseline enemy. Their damage is the definition of average. Their accuracy is below average. Their movement is 4, which I consider pretty much on average for enemies. Their health is a little higher than average, I would say. Their armor is low. They carry no block. They have very low dodge and little to no resistance. As for their attacks, they are incredibly straightforward in the sense that they just have Claw, which is a melee range, single target, low damage attack with no effects. The only consideration here is that what is going to kill you in terms of Claws is just the number of them that are out there. They are there to soak up your area effect attacks, your large propagate attacks, your poison propagate attacks, your large cone attacks. And they will generally die in a single hit, and the problem is just hitting all of them. Now, the next few mobs that we're going to talk about, starting with the armored or plated mob, are variations on the Claw theme. So, first of all, these enemies are former soldiers who had their armor on during their mutation. Somehow their deformities didn't rip it apart. This would make them, for a fun fact, if it didn't make them even tougher. So the rough stats here are that their damage, again, is very average, comparable to the other one. Their accuracy is low. They start with a negative accuracy. They're a little slower than the Claw at 3 movement. They have very low health and very high armor. So in the particular game that I was running, they were rocking about 60 health to 120 armor. So their HP pool is generally about half that of their armor. They have no block or dodge and a bit of resistance. Much like their brother, the Claw, they also only have Claw, which is a simple melee attack. The main consideration here with the armored unit is that they die to things that pierce armor, right? So this is the first bit of tutorialization. The designers are saying this unit is really hard to kill if you brute force them, because their HP pool, if you think about health plus armor, is relatively large. But if you poison them, if you hit them with a hand crossbow with armor pierce, you're going to take them down very quickly. So if you can circumvent their armor, they're very, very squishy targets. They're often ones that I look for with my poison characters because they will often die to a single cast of bees in 2 turns very, very easily. Next up, we have the Runner, which is also called in the data files the Fast Claw. Heavily mutated humans or corrupted animals, no one knows for sure. These little creatures are weaker but faster than Claws and desperate to reach the magic circle. So as the description alluded to, they have low damage and very low accuracy. I think the lowest accuracy I've seen of any enemy, but they have 6 movement points, which means they are going to be cruising compared to some of the other enemies. Their health is relatively low at 84, and then they have no armor or block and just a above average amount of dodge for tier 1 units, but not particularly high. The Claws that I was looking at had 15 dodge and no resistance. Similarly, they just have a single basic melee attack called Bite. And the thing to think about with runners is that they complicate your control of the battlefield. So we talked about it when we talked about the hero video, but each of your heroes has a diamond of influence that is the sum of the amount that they can move and then the amount that their skill range grants them distance beyond that. And the problem with runners is that after, let's say, 3 turns, they are potentially 8 tiles ahead of the next fastest unit that's traveling towards your base. And what that means is that there's a lot of distance that your heroes have to be able to cover backwards and forwards. Your heroes can't just be content to kind of be kiting backwards with the wave. So that's the complexity that runners introduce, is that they force you to split your attention. You need to have a bit of single target damage that you can project backwards if you're going to let them run past you, or you're going to have a hard time reaching the bulk of the enemies in the back. That being said, they are great targets for ballistas because they are relatively low HP and will often get killed by a single ballista shot if you have the appropriate omens, or a single mounted ballista shot. The other thing to note about runners is, unlike some of their brethren, they are very keen to do the runaround. So they will always move the furthest that they can move towards the magic circle. So unlike some other enemies that will happily go and start chewing on a wall outside of your base, if there's a gap, runners are going to run for that gap and try and run through it. What this means is that if you make a mistake and you don't focus on runners and get them down before they enter your base, they have a nasty tendency to get stuck in between buildings and become very annoying to go clean up. The next Clar varietal, aka the Dodger, the dodgy Clar in the game files, these Clars reacted a bit differently to the Mist. They now shift constantly and uncontrollably between 2 dimensions. This renders them harder to hit, and correct timing mostly depends on sheer luck. So these Clars have slightly above average damage. They're hitting just a little bit harder. They have relatively low accuracy, average movement at 4, surprisingly high health, no armor or block, and then their dodge is the highest of any of the tier 1 units, somewhere around 18 to 20%. Their single ability, again, is just a melee attack. This is a theme for all of the Clars, but they are defined by dodge, and they are trying to tutorialize the fact that having no dodge abilities or having high accuracy is critical when you're dealing with dodgy enemies. The only other note to make on dodgers is just that they also do a good job tutorializing the penalty of inaccurate attacks. Things like the Great Axe are particularly challenging to utilize because they double the dodge of enemies when you're attacking with inaccurate attacks. Moving on to the newest member of the roster, the Kindled, aka the Resist Clar in the data files. The Mist has a strange effect on these Clars. They are slowly becoming consumed by a bright flame and becoming ethereal in the process, making them more resistant to physical attacks and projectiles. So these are the tutorial enemy for resistance. Their damage is above average, their accuracy is low, their movement is right on brand at that 4 speed. Their health is exceedingly low. They have no armor, no block, no dodge, yet they are hard to kill because they have very high resistance. And in this case, we're talking about something in the 70-ish% range early on in runs. What that means is that they are very difficult to kill with melee or range damage and relatively squishy to magic damage, which carries with it a 50% resistance reduction. Their only attack is Claw, same as all of the other Clars. And this really just is here to explain to the player that it is good to have diversity of weapons. It shows the value of magic, and it really shows the value of resistance if you're trying to make a tanky character. Next up is the Blocker, and the Blocker I put at the end of tier 1 because I think there is an argument to be made for it to be a tier 2 enemy, but we'll talk about that in a second. Still desperately clinging to their shield, last remnants of their life as a soldier, these claws still hold the line. They will protect allies behind them with their bucklers, so you'll have to defeat them in order to reach the back lines. In terms of rough stats, they are very on average for damage, low for accuracy. They travel with the pack at 4 movement speed. They have relatively low health, no armor, very high block, around 30 for the ones that I was looking at, no dodge and no resist. Their single attack is claw like all of the other ones, but the special thing we need to talk about here is the fact that, as the description alluded to, they block line of sight. So these enemies are not going to let you target enemies behind them. If you stand your hero directly next to a blocker, you're going to see a conical shadowed segment behind them that is the space that you cannot target because the blocker is blocking your ability to see that space. These serve a dual purpose. They demonstrate the power of block, which is why I put them in tier 1, because they kind of like finish out the portfolio of all of the different defensive stats and having one enemy for each one. But they also kind of fit into tier 2 because they have this unique attribute of blocking line of sight that has some serious implications. So the line of sight blocking is really the thing that I want to kind of highlight strategically here, because I think that blockers they come in numerous quantities. So you're not going to be able to always target blockers first, but you have to be very cognizant of where they are on the battlefield, because they do a great job of preventing you from targeting higher value targets like powered up hunters that are standing behind them. And so you have to be very aware, because I can't even tell you the number of times where I have been like, okay, now I'm just going to kill that. Oh, I can't kill that unit because there's 3 blockers in front of it. So you need to be very aware of the line of sight issues that they create. They certainly make a strong case for skills like Third Eye as a way to get around their blocking, or watchtowers as another way to grant yourself vision. Also, skills that have vision, like the short bow's rain of arrows, also does a great job of helping you to get targeting on things that are behind blockers. So that closes out tier 1. Tier 1 is basically a bunch of crawlers, a bunch of claws, and all of those claws have a particular defensive attribute associated with them and are trying to teach you a lesson. Tier 2, on the other hand, is really about evolving those prototypes and giving them a wrinkle, something that makes them unique, makes them a higher priority target, and makes them worth understanding. The first of these is the Splitter, in the data files known as the Lumberjack. Tall, muscular, and wielding a long axe. They seem like the kind of monster that can deal a decent amount of damage in front of them. Their damage is average for tier 2. Their accuracy is a little low for tier 2, but their movement is, again, right on par with being part of the core wave for movement. They have average health for tier 2. Their armor is relatively low, proportional to the amount of health that they have, and they have a high block value. No dodge to speak of, and low resistance. I should mention here resistance for a second, because I've included this as a stat because there are a few enemies that have significant resistance. We saw the Kindled early on. We'll see a few other enemies as we go along. But all of the maps, especially the later maps like Elderlicht and Glintfine, have built-in resistance as part of the package that comes with enemies. So you will often see enemies with basic resistance across the board. But now the Splitter has 2 abilities. It has Shred and Guillotine. Shred is a AoE attack. It's the first AoE attack that we've seen on an enemy, and it hits the 3 targets in front of the Splitter. They also have a higher damage single target ability called Guillotine that is just their standard melee attack. The thing to think about with Splitters is that they are somewhat spongy, right? Their health pool is larger than the largest health pool in tier 1. And as long as they don't get to your walls, they're not going to be doing much. But I would say that this unit's kind of class identity is taking down your walls. If they get to your walls and they use the shred ability, they're going to be doing a bunch of damage to multiple walls or defenses, whatever they get to. And that's where you're going to start to see your defenses falling very rapidly. So they are worth targeting ahead of claws. They're worth getting some damage in on, but because they are primarily a melee enemy, you have a very good idea of when they are going to become effective, and you can really dispatch them at the last possible moment. Next up is the Lancer. Once members of an elite guard, their armor and spear are part of them now, enhancing their skill. They have great reach and can pierce even the toughest armor. So the Lancer is a high damage, accurate enemy with slightly above average movement at 5. They have above average health, high amounts of armor compared to that health. So their overall pool of armor and health is relatively high. No block to speak of, low dodge, and low resistance. And they are going to be doing Impale as their primary attack, which is a range 1 to 2 ability that targets one enemy and has armor piercing. And that armor piercing is really the core of what makes the Lancer's identity sing, because they are going to be doing chip damage to your heroes where other enemies would not, and that chip damage has a tendency to stack up very quickly. So my experience has generally been, if I ever make a tanky a tanky hero, they're still going to be taking a surprising amount of damage from the Lancers because I rely heavily on armor to protect them. Additionally, the nature of Impale and the fact that they have one additional range reach is something that you sometimes don't notice, because when you hold down Alt, you're like, oh, I have the one tile gap between me and where the red line is, so I'm going to be okay. And then Lancer comes up and pokes you, and it can be pretty frustrating. They ironically fall victim primarily to the thing that they also victimize you with, which is to say that they are great targets for any of your armor piercing attacks, because while their health pool is decent sized, their armor pool is generally like twice the size of it. So if you can start dealing health damage immediately with something like a hand crossbow, you're going to be better off. Next up, we get to the Crawler, not to be confused with the Clar. The Crawler, even more vicious than runners, these creatures actively search for breaches and rush the magic circle. Many heroes have lost their self-control when these nimble beasts kept evading their attacks. Crawlers are the bane of my existence, but let's talk about their stats. Their damage is pretty average, their accuracy is low, their movement is very high at 7 base, not on Apocalypse levels. As a note, on Apocalypse 5, when they get that movement increase, I believe they get 2 points of movement, making their movement 9, which is a nightmare. They have a decent amount of health at around 200 in the clips that I looked at. Low armor. No block, high dodge, and low resistance. They're just going to be biting as their primary ability, but these guys are a huge pain in the butt because of their high mobility coupled with dodge. As we mentioned before, the challenge of runners is the challenge of claws, and that is that they're going to press forward, and they're going to end up in your base before everybody else, and you're going to have to deal with them. The problem is that they are going to prey on the fact that you're going to be using single target abilities. You're going to be using Longbow's Isolation Shot. You're going to be using Magic Orb's Infect. And every time you attack with those, you're potentially going to be missing. And if you're missing, you're spending lots of action points on these particular enemies. The other issue that they have is, much like runners, if they start to get inside of your base, you're going to start to have line of sight issues with them, and chasing them down you can spend a whole turn chasing a runner or a crawler. And in the case of a crawler, you may get there and not have enough action points to actually take them out. This is like a theme, or I don't know, but a general observation. Runners and claws, in my experience, have a very detrimental effect on night success, because they are panic engines. They generate a huge amount of panic because they move quickly and then they hit buildings. Even for very nominal amounts of damage, they're still creating that panic. So dealing with them and having a plan for them is a really good idea. That's why I like to go with ballista-based strats for a lot of my runs, because ballistas do a good job on, they do a great job on runners, and they do okay against claws. Next up, we have the archer. What's worse than a claw? A claw attacking you from afar. They don't deal that much damage by themselves, but combined with other creatures attacking simultaneously, they can be a real threat. As the description implies, their damage is pretty average. Their movement is 4. Their health is low, while their armor is pretty average. So they are not a particularly resilient unit. They have no block or dodge to speak of and low resists. But the problem is that they attack with range, specifically a range of 1 to 5, with a relatively low damage on it. That's maiming shot. The thing that makes them special is that this is the first time we have seen a ranged enemy. And ranged enemies break a paradigm that is very fundamental to our previous understanding of the game, which is that no matter how many mobs are near your hero, only the ones in the cardinal directions, north, east, south, and west, are going to be able to hit them. You're going to have at most 4 enemies hitting your unit until archers show up. And then all of a sudden, you can have 10 enemies attacking your unit at the same time, and that eats through a lot of armor. So while they don't do a lot of damage singularly, they have a tendency to be that kind of like sleeper, oh my gosh, I can't believe my hero just died. And you add to that the fact that maiming shot comes with a -1 movement penalty, and you also run into a problem where once you get entrapped by a set of archers, you've lost all your movement and you have a hard time getting away, and then they can slowly peck you down. So don't sleep on archers. I've lost a lot of heroes to them. Focus on the fact that they have low health. They're great targets for bees. They're great targets for armor piercing. Next up is the hopper, another slightly later on added enemy, also known as the poison frog in the data files. These dastardly creatures are feared for the strange liquid they spit. While it is highly toxic to humans, it strengthens the body of monsters mutated by the mist. So this is a buffing enemy first and foremost, I would say, with like a side of poison. So they have relatively low damage, their accuracy is relatively low, their movement is right on that in the middle of the wave at 4 movement points. Their health is average, no armor, no block, low dodge, but high resist. So we're starting to see a little resist creeping back in, much like the Kindled. But they have 4 abilities. They have a standard claw ability, which is your melee type of thing. They then have spit acid, which is going to poison you for 3 turns at a range of 2 to 3. Interestingly, if you're standing directly next to a hopper, it cannot poison you. I didn't know that until I started doing the research for this video. Then it has 2 buffs that it's going to be doing, and they are the same, but they are applied in 2 different ways. Acid armor is a single target, buff the resist of a particular enemy that it chooses, and then acid burst is the same thing, but it is an on-death effect. When the hopper dies, all of the units adjacent to it will get the acid armor buff. I would say hoppers are most annoying from my perspective for their poison. If they start to poison you, again, this is chip damage that is sometimes hard to recover, although the amount of poison that they are giving is relatively small, but the fact that it is bypassing all of your defensive stats, your resist, your block, your armor, is a little frustrating. The buff that they give is pretty nominal. I don't worry too much about hoppers buffing the resistance of enemies because the 8-ish% that they're giving isn't too transformative. I would say hoppers are not a particularly high priority target, but they are relatively annoying if they start to lay down a lot of poison. On to the winged in the data files known as the gargoyle. These bird-like monsters thrive on harassing the city and spreading panic. They tend to avoid the battlefield, so they probably descend from chickens. If it wasn't obvious, they're flying. Their damage is pretty average. Their accuracy is right on average. They are slightly faster than most of the enemies at 5. They have pretty average health for tier 2, no armor, no block, a little bit of dodge, and again, we're seeing that high resist, about the same amount of resist that we saw on the Hopper. As is alluded to, the winged enemy has flying and has a attack pattern that is kind of flanking, for lack of a better descriptor. You will not see them kind of coming straight into your base. They have a tendency to kind of like gravitate towards the corners or sides where there's no fight going on. Their only ability is Claw, which is just a melee attack, not of particular note. But ultimately, what they are doing is something very similar to what runners are doing and what crawlers are doing, and that is splitting your attention. The difference here is that the previous enemies we talked about are moderately squishy. The crawler has a little bit more resilience because of their dodge, but here the combination of resistance with a decent HP pool means that it is very frustrating to kill winged enemies. It's good for you to use your magic users to try to take them down, but overall there is a lot of cost that generally goes into taking down one of these winged enemies, but it's usually worth it because your ballistas are going to have a harder time with them, and they can often get themselves into some pretty annoying and awkward positions. Also, flying means that they have some attack vectors that you don't otherwise consider, like they can fly over the water in Lakeburg. They don't care about your walls and will fly over them. So you need to be pretty mindful of them, or they're going to end up in the middle of your town wreaking absolute havoc. But that takes care of tier 2. You can see how we're starting to get some more units with some funky combinations of things, some interesting attack patterns, some unique abilities. But tier 3 is where stuff starts to get particularly twisted. Every one of these enemies has a unique twist. They are often very, very resilient, very slow to kill. You're going to sink a lot of resources into them, and sometimes you're going to spend a lot of time buffing up other enemies or making your life particularly difficult. The first that we're going to talk about is the Accursed, aka the Ghost, in the data files. Believing in ghosts is common, whether or not they actually exist. Corrupted mind-playing ghosts might seem a little over the top, but unfortunately they exist. They now exist without a doubt. They love paralyzing people with fear and confusing their senses. Their damage is relatively low, although that doesn't stop them from being deeply annoying. They're pretty average accuracy. They're a little faster than some of your other enemies at 5 movement points. They have high health, a rather significant health pool for tier 2. I should say not necessarily for tier 3. They're actually pretty squishy for tier 3 and might belong in tier 2. They're one of those borderline ones. No armor, no block, low dodge, and then high resist at 40%. They have 3 abilities. Spectral Orb is a melee range damage attack that I think I've never seen them use because I generally don't get that close to them. Then they have Frighten, which is perhaps their most annoying attack. It is 4 range, has a single target, and drains 1 AP. And then they have Magic Exhaustion, which is a range 1 to 6 and drains mana instead. Of note, Frighten cannot be used anymore after an Accursed is damaged, so that is a useful little detail. But their specialty is really draining your heroes if they get too close, and they are relatively resilient in the combination of having a decent size health pool and some resist. So overall, things to think about, the minus AP and minus mana is going to sneak up on you. You don't want to be in range of this enemy unless you are there to kill it. Next up on the list is the Boomer. Oversaturated with the enemy, with the energy and highly unstable, these abominations explode upon reaching their target, causing considerable amount of damage around. Veteran tip, don't get too close when killing them. So this is a high damage, average accuracy, 4 movement, above average amount of health, larger than the Accursed. So I guess I should refrain from calling the Accursed a high health enemy. They have no armor to speak of, no block to speak of, low dodge, but a decent amount of resistance. And their headlining feature is, like the description said, they explode. And they have 2 different versions of explosion that are worth talking about. When you kill them, they will do damage in a ring around them to 8 targets. When they attack, they will blow up, dealing damage to 9 squares centered 1 tile away from them. And this is an important distinction because of the way that it deceptively makes certain things work. So to give you the simplest example, if you have a boomer and it walks up to your wall and it explodes on your wall, it is going to explode 2 tiles forward, aka if there's a ballista behind that wall, that ballista will also be destroyed by the boomer. It essentially lunges forward and explodes at the same time. That can be a little confusing, and if it catches you off guard, it can do pretty awful things. Generally speaking, this is the single enemy that you want to be, well, one of the single enemies you want to be very aware of where it is relative to your heroes. Do not let it walk up to one of your heroes, because it will explode on them and it will do a ton of damage to even the tankiest of heroes. The flip side of the boomer is that they work for you. If you can get them in a pack of other enemies, maybe using some snares, something like that, leave them around for a little bit, get a bunch of enemies around them and blow them up, they're doing a bunch of free work for you. So boomers can be a blessing, which is generally not something I say about any of the tier 3 enemies, except for boomers, perhaps. Next on the list, we have the bulky. Mutation caused by the mist can be really monstrous and powerful, and bulkies are a perfect example. Their attacks are devastating, and they can use their strength to hurl boulders at heroes. Thankfully, they're pretty rare. So their damage is above average, their accuracy is right on average, they are slow at only 3 movement points, their health is very high, we're talking like 1,000 HP. These are big boys. They have a little bit of armor, maybe like 10% of that, around 100. They have very high block, 36 on the one that I was looking at, and a bit of resist. They have 2 abilities, and the first of these 2 is the one that you really need to pay attention to, and that is Throw Boulder. It is a range 5 ability that stuns the target, and having one of your heroes stunned is very bad for business. So you will regularly see me paying attention to where a bulky is, where that bulky is going to move, and then how far 5 more tiles from there is. They also have a smash attack, which is very, very high damage. Don't get in melee range of bulkies. It's bad for business. Bulkies are one of those enemies that I think the primary strategy is snare them up and keep them in the back of the pack until you're ready to kill them. They're not a buffing enemy, so there's no real need to run up and kill them right off the bat. If you have the ability to slow them down, like 1 smoke screen from a rifle is going to stop a bulky in their tracks. But bulkies have very high combined armor and health pool, and there's a lot of work goes into killing them. Next up, we have the Guardian. Using their tentacles and sticky flesh, they have collected the shields of numerous fallen soldiers, waving them around with precision. They provide shelter to nearby monsters and block line of sight. So much like the blocker, they're going to be a line of sight impediment, and that is worth bearing in mind. But in terms of their stats, they're not doing a lot of damage. Their accuracy is average. Their movement is 4, which is very average. They have a very small health pool at only 200. No armor to speak of, very high block, and then low dodge and low resist. So Guardians are primarily mitigating through block, and then relying on a small health pool. They're still relatively difficult to kill, but the Guardian's headlining feature is that they are going to be buffing primarily. So they have Lash, which is a melee attack, nothing particularly interesting. Then they have Transfusion, which adds 100 HP permanently to an enemy within 5 tiles of them. And they have shelter, which is a point blank diamond around them. The 12 nearest targets to them will receive 30 block. These can both of these buffs can be problematic. Transfusion in particular can be very frustrating. The Guardians have a relatively effective AI and will usually pick the buffest enemy. So you can find yourself in a position where if you leave a Guardian unattacked, it can put 400 extra health on a splitter and make that splitter as big as a bulky. We already talked about the line of sight blocking. This can be a problem when coupled with archers or coupled with hunters, but primarily the Guardian is problematic for its buffing capacity. Transfusion is important, but shelter also can make it very frustrating. You should be aware of when a Guardian has recently sheltered particular enemies in order to know where it might be better to wait a little bit before attacking, because those enemies are going to be significantly more resilient than they normally would be. Overall, the Guardian is one of those enemies that you want to focus on earlier if possible. If you can get out to them and get them killed sooner, you're potentially taking a lot of additional health off of the playing field by not letting them get those transfusions off. Next up is the Hunter. I've talked a lot about them, but here they are. These sharpshooters roam the battlefield in search of their next prey. Once they have set their sights on something, they will meticulously aim before unleashing a precise shot from afar. The Hunter is really an evolution of the Archer. Their damage is above average, their accuracy is high for even tier 3 enemies, their movement is right on the average at 4, they have relatively low health, no armor, no block, high dodge, around 20% give or take, and a bit of resistance. But what makes them frustrating is, first of all, that their primary attack, which is not quite as high on the damage and that they can do anytime they want, comes with a block debuff, which can occasionally cause problems for your more defensively inclined heroes. But the real headlining feature is take aim. So if there is one of your heroes within range, within 10 tiles of the Hunter, they have the ability to take aim, which will charge them up. And once they are charged, the next turn, they have the ability to unleash an aimed shot. Aimed shot consumes that effect and does heavy damage to a particular target within 10 range. 10 range is relatively large range. So the issue that you run into with Hunters is if a lot of them stack up and then start taking aim, you potentially have a lot of uncontrolled enemies that can project a lot of damage to a lot of places very unpredictably. It's a great way to lose ballistas. It's a great way to get your buildings shot. And it's also a great way to just to get your heroes, your squishier heroes, maybe your glass cannon heroes hit when you least expect it. And the damage that they're carrying is non-trivial. So I generally think that Hunters, especially Hunters that have had time to charge up, are a likely target for me in a given turn. Although, as we mentioned before, if they're stuck behind blockers or stuck behind Guardians, you can quickly find yourself in a much less tenable situation where someone has to go deep behind enemy lines in order to get some kills. The next enemy we're going to talk about is the Ripper, also known as the Bloody in the data files. Completely dependent on blood and flesh, they prey on heroes. When this isn't possible, they won't hesitate to feast on weaker members of the Horde to satisfy their thirst. So these are a high damage, low accuracy enemy with relatively high movement. I would say that in a way, these are kind of the evolution of the runner and the crawler. Unlike their smaller brethren, they have a higher, above average health pool, no armor, no block, low dodge, and low resist. But as the description indicated, they will feast on other members of the Horde. They will pick a random claw and eat them. It is an unblockable, guaranteed kill action that grants them one additional move and additional damage. What this essentially turns into is if you leave Rippers in the back line of the enemy horde early on, they will very quickly find themselves at 7 or 8 movement, having killed 3 things and plus 45% damage. So as they eat more enemies, they get stronger and stronger, and they become more and more of a problem. Because of their high mobility, they're another likely candidate for ending up in your base by surprise or chomping on one of your ballistas well before you thought the horde was going to make it that far. Generally speaking, they're usually a high priority for me, but I find that because of their high mobility, they're often in my face pretty early on in waves, and usually good targets for isolated attacks to try and take them down. You're really just focused on the health pool of the Ripper and trying to get that down as quickly as possible, and there's no real defensive stats standing in your way. Next up is the Twisted. Even those who once fought against the mist can fall victim to it. A former mage mutated by the mist can be a formidable foe. They act as cruel commanders on the battlefield and can cast a wide array of spells. Twisted are scary, no doubt about it. Their damage is high, their accuracy is average, their movement is average at 4. Their health is high. The one that I was looking at was 1,000 hit points, but they certainly go higher than that as well. No armor or block to speak of, low dodge, but high resistance. High resistance, and sometimes it gets higher, but we'll get to that in a second. They have 4 abilities. They have Magic Lash, which is their standard attack up to 3 tiles away. Command, which is a buff that they can do to any enemy within 5 tiles that grants them movement. That's one to watch out for. We don't like our hordes getting faster. Then they have Channel Spell, which is a charge ability, a lot like the Hunters, but the difference is that this one carries immunity, so no poison and no stunning, and 50% increase to resistance. Coupled with their higher resists, I think that generally puts them around 80 to 85% resistance, which makes them extremely difficult to kill once they have channeled their spell. And then once they have channeled the spell, they can use that charge token to unleash Magic Burst, which is basically like a mini 5-target death ray, range 2 to 5, no dodge, and no block. Twisted are a bit of a jack of all trades. They are a charger, they are a buffer, and they are a damage dealer. And you need to take them out quickly because of the buffing early on, and then the damage as they get closer to your base. They really have a lot of range and they can cause a lot of problems. They're generally my highest priority target. You won't find them until like later on in the harder difficulties. Like they're not going to be showing up in early Lakeburg or Gildenberg, so you don't have to worry about them there. But once they channel, they are incredibly difficult to kill, and then they will often be wreaking a lot of havoc with that mini death ray. So Twisted are high priority targets. You want to be taking them down quickly. So that was tier 3. That's all of the enemies. The only thing we have left to talk about here are elites. And elites are just modified versions of all of the enemies that we talked about. They all come with unique art, which I think is really cool, and I don't want to spoil any of that. So you'll see them as they show up in your games, but like things like the elite bulkies or the elite twisted are super cool when you get a chance to see them. But in terms of the elites, there are 7 modifiers at present. All elites are going to get increased stats across the board. They will have more HP, etc. But as I understand it, the elite modifiers are, and please let me know if I'm forgetting any, because this is one that there's no information on the wiki about, so I'm kind of going based off of memory. But there is Misty, which is essentially they act like a mist sensor. I don't know if in the beginner's guides we've talked about mist sensors, but basically there will be a cloud of mist around them that prevents you from targeting enemies next to them unless you run up and get in their face. increased health pool, or I think it's just called health or healthy, can make some absolutely staggering health pools for enemies. Then you have regeneration, and regeneration is no slouch. I think I've seen as much as like 40% regeneration per turn. So these are enemies that you often have to neutralize with something like snares until you're ready to have like 3 units focus fire them. Because I've had enemies that have like 3,000 hit points, 40% regeneration. So if you're not killing them on a particular turn, they're potentially regenning 1,500, 1,000 hit points type of thing. Then there's Mirror Shield, which just means that a certain amount of damage is going to be reflected back on you when you attack that particular enemy. You want to focus on heavy hitters with them. Momentum and Opportunism put up big numbers for single hits, and you want to avoid things like multi-hit that are going to be pretty slow. And then the last elite category that I remember off of the top of my head or from my research is Energized. And Energized allows a particular enemy to move twice before they attack. And Energized is one of those ones that you need to be very aware of it because they become the fastest enemies on the battlefield, and an Energized Lancer or an Energized Elite Claw can really cover an incredible amount of distance in no time flat. We wanted to talk about all of the enemies. We wanted to talk about what makes them unique, how to think about them, get you familiar with them, get you familiar with what they look like. And we've accomplished that. This is setting the stage for the next video that I am going to do, which is going to be all about the combat phase. So I mentioned at the beginning, target selection is important. Now we understand the targets. The next stage is understanding how to contextualize those targets in terms of a strategic plan. And we'll be discussing that in great detail in that video. But for now, that's going to do it for me on this one. If this was useful to you, toss me a like. A subscription would be greatly appreciated, especially if you're looking to catch the future guides as I release them. If you haven't already watched my previous guides, now is a great time to go back. There'll be a playlist in the video description that links you to all of my other beginner's guides. They cover everything from builds to hero stats to the meta progression system, and I would highly recommend them. But that's it. Have a good one, and I'll see you all in the next one. Bye-bye.